I'm Elliot Peters, and this is What Was That About?, a show that tries to get to the point of every movie. This week we're covering a groundbreaking science fiction film from 1977 by master director Steven Spielberg. It's Close Encounters of the Third Kind. You can expect a quick plot refresher, a couple deep dives, a tangent or two, and at the end we'll decide once and for all, what was that about? All that and more after this quick intro. Welcome back to the show. We're going to mix up the formula a little bit this week. Over the last 7 episodes, I've been really trying to find my footing here in this podcasting audio landscape. I've had a lot of fun, but I think it's about time that I start trying to throw a couple curveballs into the mix to see if there's other places that we can take this show. Don't worry, we're still going to be talking about the themes of our favorite movies together. We're just going to try a couple different approaches. This week, we're talking about Close Encounters to coincide with the release of Spielberg's latest science fiction film, Disclosure Day, which looks like it's going to deal with a lot of the same themes and concepts and may even be a kind of spiritual sequel to this one. Steven Spielberg is on record as a believer in extraterrestrial life. Whether he believes that they have made contact with Earth or not is up to interpretation. He may inflate these beliefs for the sake of media exposure each time he comes out with a new Alien film, but the guy certainly seems fascinated by them. From Close Encounters, to E.T., to Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, and War of the Worlds, unexplainable phenomena in connection with extraterrestrial life is a recurring story device in many of his most influential movies. And for good reason. The guy was born in 1946. The infamous Roswell incident occurred in 1947, the incident that sparked the UFO craze of the ensuing decade and a half, and a cultural fascination with outer space that may be said to have culminated in the space race and the monumental moon landing. For much of Spielberg's adolescence, popular culture was obsessed with aliens. He grew up in a world in which people fell on either side of a strict divide between believers and non-believers. And the guy was a dreamer. Of course he was enamored with the more fantastical option. So let's talk about Close Encounters of the Third Kind. This movie came out in 1977. It was directed and written by Steven Spielberg, which is kind of an anomaly. Spielberg doesn't often write the screenplays of films that he directs. He works very closely with screenwriters to develop a story, but a lot of the time the screenplay is written by someone else. Close Encounters is an outlier. The cinematography was by Vilmos Zsigmond, with a cast that includes Richard Dreyfuss, Terry Garr, Melinda Dillon, and Francois Truffaut. It was edited by legendary film editor Michael Kahn, with music by frequent Spielberg collaborator John Williams. What do I love about this movie? Close Encounters of the Third Kind is one of Spielberg's most visually arresting and earliest masterpieces. This is really only, if memory serves, his third theatrical feature film, a blockbuster success which came hot on the heels of his box office shattering Jaws. Close Encounters has cemented itself as a definitive piece of science fiction from the 20th century. But what was it about? On paper, while driving along a country road late at night, a family man named Roy Neary, played by Richard Dreyfuss, suffers a close encounter with what appears to be extraterrestrial life. He is subsequently driven into conflict with his wife and children as he attempts to piece together mysterious visions in order to find out if there really is life beyond our planet. Meanwhile, a French scientist named Claude Lacombe, played by Francois Truffaut, goes on a globe-trotting voyage to uncover the same mystery on a larger scale. Beneath the surface, Close Encounters tells a story of purpose, communication, and the great beyond. The first angle that I would like to approach this from is more of a spiritual reading. There is a biblical, almost religious calling to the Devil's Tower. Like the ascent of Moses in the Ten Commandments, a parallel that the movie directly invites us to make by showing a scene from Cecil B. DeMille's Ten Commandments film. To this point, the characters seem to be overcome with a kind of religious euphoria around extraterrestrials and their close encounters. The film deals with an almost religious sort of revelation. The idea of discovering alien life is treated like a religious revelation. It's treated as something divine being visited upon the mortals, the human beings. There's one line of recurring dialogue, which repeats multiple times throughout the film, by both Roy and Lacombe. This means something. This is important. They say this in reference to some incommunicable piece of information or evidence of beings beyond our comprehension. The visions of the Devil's Tower, the 5-note musical refrain, and the intentions of the aliens in choosing their abductees seemingly at random. I'll now read an excerpt from Andrew Gordon's review of Close Encounters, which he titles The Gospel According to Steven Spielberg. This comes from Literature Film Quarterly, Volume 8, Number 3, which was published in 1980. While I don't agree with Gordon's overall negative perspective on the film, I do agree with the following sentiment. Quote, Close Encounters of the Third Kind has been hailed by several prestigious critics as essentially a religious film. It's a going to Bethlehem story, writes Pauline Kael, and Stanley Kaufman calls it not so much a film as an event in the history of faith. There has always been a strain of the evangelical in science fiction literature and film, which accounts for its occasional cult followings. After all, outer space is naturally confused with heaven, and the sense of wonder at the heart of much science fiction and fantasy is akin to religious awe. Both science and religion are engaged in speculations about the infinite, and, stretching the definition a bit, the Bible might be called one of the world's first science fiction stories. End quote. Close Encounters is a film which deals very heavily in the dedication of faith without answers, and the desire for a higher purpose. Both Roy and Lacombe embody the lengths that people will go to in order to achieve a higher calling. Roy is chosen, Lacombe is not, yet they both seem to aspire to a kind of discovery, and they both hold within themselves a lot of faith. Additionally, there are certain things which must be sacrificed in this pursuit. Interestingly, Spielberg draws a very, very gendered line between who is allowed to make those sacrifices and who is not. Roy leaves a wife and children behind, while Gillian stays with her son. You may point out that Gillian is a single parent, and Roy is not, but the first humans to return out of the spacecraft are military men. Men who symbolize a gendered ideal of venturing out and leaving one's attachments for a so-called higher calling. It's worth noting that Spielberg made this film before he himself had children, and he has gone on record saying that if he were to make the film today, he would be unable to justify Roy leaving his family behind. I'd now like to perform a bit more of a genre reading. Nestled between 2001: A Space Odyssey in, I believe, 1968, and the sci-fi boom which would follow Star Wars, Close Encounters grounds itself in a slow-burn plotline that gives way to a profound finale. The special effects are cutting-edge, employing many of the same wizards that brought George Lucas's vision of intergalactic adventures to life earlier that very same year. In regards to where the science fiction genre kind of lay at this point in time, little gray men were solidified as an extraterrestrial archetype by the Barney and Betty Hill abduction claim from 1961. We'll talk more about them later, but for now, technology writer Wade Rausch attributes Spielberg's use of this depiction of alien life directly to the Hills claim, saying, quote, the standard depiction of aliens at this point became the little gray man. So when Steven Spielberg came along and made probably what are the two most influential movies about aliens, Close Encounters of the Third Kind and E.T. the Extraterrestrial, the aliens and those movies were both basically variations on the 1950s and 1960s little green or little gray man image. It's noteworthy that literary depictions of aliens as little gray men predate the Hills by at least 60 years, since H.G. Wells's description of Martians in War of the Worlds includes gray, hairless skin and large, dark, oval eyes. Close Encounters devotes itself to a grounded type of sci-fi that really can only be compared to Kubrick's 2001 out of all its other contemporaries. It's not interested in the pulp interpretations of alien life that were born from the B-movie craze around 20 years previous. It actually attempts to imagine what kind of response the world might have to this type of phenomenon occurring in its present day and age. Spielberg went so far as to consult scientific and government professionals who had some kind of idea of what this really would look like. In the 1970s, Spielberg seems to be advocating that humanity is ready for contact. Yet here we are, you and me, 50 years later, and there's still no word from the heavens. The analog technology used in this movie is part of what makes it so engrossing to watch. There's a whole sequence in which Laughlin, the cartographer turned unofficial interpreter, realizes that the aliens are sending them coordinates. And rather than pulling up Google Earth on the nearest iPad, the scientists immediately have to scramble to locate a globe and physically rotate it to find the location the aliens are indicating. It's a wonderful visual that you couldn't get in a story these days. But that is a uniquely modern viewing experience. Within the context of the film, the technology is not seen as a limitation. humanity is ready for contact. They are able to organize across borders in order to make this happen. Next, I'd like to approach this from a little bit of a historical reading. There are several story elements which are adapted from real-world abduction and close encounter stories. Lost time, electromagnetic phenomena, gravity anomalies, sunburns, etc. This is all part of Spielberg's dedication to realism, and it makes the impact of the fantastical elements of the story all the more enthralling that they are based on true accounts of impossible things apparently happening before our very eyes. Up top, I briefly mentioned the Roswell incident. The following is from Encyclopedia Britannica. In 1947, the United States and other countries were in the midst of a flying saucer craze, as people reported seeing strange objects in the sky that they claimed were spacecraft piloted by aliens. It was against this background that a rancher, W. Mac Brazel, discovered some unusual debris near Roswell, New Mexico in June. The material included tinfoil, rubber strips, and sticks. The following month, he took the items to the Roswell sheriff, who in turn contacted the Roswell Army Airfield. After collecting the wreckage, the airfield issued an extraordinary press release that stated that a flying disc had been retrieved from a local ranch. The Roswell Daily Record immediately picked up the press release, and on July 8th, the story was printed with the headline, "RAAF Captures Flying Saucer on Ranch in Roswell Region." Almost immediately, however, the military announced that the saucer had actually been a weather balloon carrying a radar target, a device somewhat like a box kite, made of foiled paper fastened to a balsa wood frame. The Roswell Morning Dispatch noted the new claim in a July 9, 1947 story entitled "Army Debunks Roswell Flying Disc as World Simmers with Excitement." However, the article also included an interview with Brazel, who did not believe that the debris he discovered was from a weather balloon. The Roswell incident subsequently faded from the headlines, though the interest in UFOs and aliens continued. Then, a book entitled The Roswell Incident was published in 1980. The book's authors, Charles Berlitz and William L. Moore, labeled the weather balloon explanations a cover story. They argued that the original debris, which they believed was from a crashed flying saucer, had been flown to Wright Field, later Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, near Dayton, Ohio, and material from a weather balloon was hastily substituted. Although the book was widely disputed, it sparked additional conspiracy theories, as well as a number of hoaxes. Notably, in 1984, documents surfaced that were alleged to be classified memos concerning Majestic 12, a secret operation launched by President Harry S. Truman to handle the Roswell incident. The documents, however, were later determined to be fake, and no evidence was found to support the existence of MJ-12. This was followed by an alleged alien autopsy film in 1995 that purported to show the dissection of an alien corpse from the Roswell incident. The 17-minute video was later claimed to be a fraud by its director. Rather than ending the conspiracy theories, however, these hoaxes sparked increased interest in the incident, and Roswell became synonymous with UFOs and aliens. Indeed, the incident became a significant part of the city's economy. In 1992, the International UFO Museum and Research Center opened in Roswell, and since 1996, Roswell has been the site of an annual UFO festival. Ironically, Berlitz and Moore were right about one thing. The government's claim that a weather balloon crashed at Roswell was incorrect. In 1994, the Air Force admitted that the recovered material was in reality from a U.S. spy balloon. Part of Project Mogul, it was an attempt to monitor anticipated nuclear tests by the Soviet Union. In 1997, a definitive Air Force report, the Roswell Report Case Closed, ventured the opinion that stories of alien bodies may have come from civilian witnesses who saw parachute crash test dummies, a severely injured airman parachutist, and charred bodies from an airplane crash during the 1950s. The report proposed that the witnesses consolidated the separate events, the Project Mogul materials, the crash test dummies, the airman, and the charred bodies, in their memories. For many UFOologists, however, these explanations were seen as part of a continued cover-up by the U.S. government. So Close Encounters came out in 1977, so before the Roswell Incident book was published, and after Roswell had kind of faded from public memory, but it still existed as this cultural touchpoint, this moment in time, just 1 year before Steven Spielberg himself was born, during which this UFO craze had kind of swept the nation, and the media was really running with it, so civilians' imaginations were sparked. The second incident that I think has some bearing on Close Encounters of the Third Kind, I have also already mentioned. Barney and Betty Hill's abduction claim in 1961. The following is from the Appalachian Mountain Club. In September of 1961, Betty and Barney Hill were driving from Montreal, Canada, to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, on the way home from their belated honeymoon. As an interracial couple, before those unions were fully accepted by society, the Hills were passionate about advancing the civil rights movement. They volunteered at their local church and were both members of the NAACP. After deciding to take a well-deserved break, the Hills planned a spontaneous road trip from Montreal to Niagara Falls. Though the couple had been married for 16 months, they had never been on their honeymoon, and viewed this trip as the opportune time. On the last night of their trip, the Hills departed a diner in Vermont around 10 p.m., hoping to make it back to Portsmouth around 2 a.m. However, as they drove, they noticed a bright light in the sky that appeared to be following them. With every mile they drove, the light grew bigger and brighter. The light continued to follow them, even as they drove through the winding roads of the White Mountains. Sometimes the light would move behind the trees and disappear, only to reappear moments later. Eventually, the couple grew so curious that they decided to pull over and investigate. Through a pair of binoculars, Betty realized that the light was some sort of object spinning in the air, presumably a flying saucer. The couple continued driving until they reached Route 3 in Lincoln, when the object hovered just over 100 feet above the car. Barney abruptly stopped, got out of the car with a handgun, and saw something that was as big as a jet, but as flat as a pancake. Behind the windows of the object were beings in gray uniforms who told Barney to put down his binoculars. He tried to raise his pistol, but somehow found himself unable to. Realizing that he was about to be captured, he ran back to the car and sped off. At some point, Betty and Barney Hill heard strange beeping noises from their trunk, felt drowsy, and eventually lost consciousness. The next morning, the couple woke up in their house in Portsmouth, with no recollection of the events that occurred the night before. However, Barney's shoes had been scuffed, Betty's dress had been torn, and both of their watches had stopped working. Through months of psychology sessions and hypnosis, which was a popular technique at the time, the couple began to recall what had happened to them. According to the Hills, the UFO had landed on their car as they were speeding down the mountains and put them to sleep. Afterwards, the gray beings they had seen earlier had led them up a long ramp into the spacecraft. Once inside, the Hills were separated and individually tested. They were asked to climb on a metal table and remove their clothes, where the gray beings would pluck their hairs, take clippings from their nails, and peel off parts of their skin. Each sample was placed on something that resembled a glass slide. The gray beings also probed needles into their arms, legs, and heads. Throughout the ordeal, Betty and Barney Hill claimed that one of the beings was the leader, who was observing the process from the side. Later, alone with the leader, Betty asked where the craft had flown. Under hypnosis, she replicated the star map shown to her on the ship. Years later, a woman named Marjorie Fish attempted to interpret Betty's reproduction of the map and concluded that the beings had come from the star system Zeta Reticuli. Though the story of Betty and Barney Hill was not the first tale of alien abduction, theirs was the most well-documented and feasibly legitimate. After this encounter, Betty Hill continued doing research on UFOs for the remainder of her life, and the story of the Hills became one of the most widely publicized alien encounters in history. Before the Hills experience, aliens were portrayed as friendly creatures who would commute back and forth between Earth and their home planets. However, after the Hills shared their story, alien abductions became better known for their mystery and intrigue. Betty and Barney Hill drew pictures of what the spaceship had looked like, and those images bear a striking resemblance to the spacecraft in Close Encounters. Spielberg and the production designers for Close Encounters obviously took a lot of inspiration from Betty and Barney Hill's account of their abduction. From the design of the spacecraft to the look of the aliens, as well as the long ramp up which Betty and Barney Hill were told to enter the spacecraft, a lot of it sounds very, very similar to what you see in Close Encounters. The third component of real-world history that has a huge influence on Close Encounters is the existence of Project Blue Book. The following is again from Encyclopedia Britannica. Project Blue Book is the code name for the United States' longest-running Air Force program dedicated to investigating sightings of UFOs, which ran from 1952 to 1969. The program generated controversy because of its subject matter and the secrecy surrounding its operation. Project Blue Book was the successor of two similar programs. The first was Project Sign, a classified program that tried to explain a number of military-reported UFO sightings and determine whether they were extraterrestrial in origin, while also considering potential threats to national security, especially those related to possible espionage by the Soviet Union. Project Sign lasted from December 1947 to February 1949. Take note that 1947 is the year of the Roswell incident. During its existence, Project Sign investigated 243 different sightings. It was scaled down to become Project Grudge, which persisted for 6 more months and collected 244 additional sighting reports. Project Blue Book was launched in March 1952, and it began accepting reports of sightings from the public, as well as the military and government. The three projects are often collectively considered Project Blue Book. Project Blue Book was headquartered at Wright Air Force Base, now Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, near Dayton, Ohio. From 1947 to 1969, 12,618 sightings were recorded. Of these, 701 remained labeled unidentified when the program concluded. Records from the project concerning reports of individual or group sightings totaled tens of thousands of pages, with additional pages of project files, police reports, newspaper clippings, administrative documents, footage, and photographs. The declassified and redacted records have been housed at the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. since 1976 and are available to the public. No physical evidence of extraterrestrial origin was collected during the course of the project. Project Blue Book was named for the blue exam booklets frequently used in American college testing, indicating the project administrator's intent to apply a scholarly and methodical approach to the program. They created a questionnaire for sighting reports, aiming to standardize documentation of a highly subjective experience. The majority of sightings reported were assigned ordinary earthly explanations: natural phenomena, human error, hoaxes, and the largest category, mistaken identification of military or civilian aircraft. The sightings that remain unidentified are fairly evenly divided among each year of the program and its precursor's existence, except for 1952, which has 303 unexplained sightings. Many of the reports from this year concern a group of sightings over Washington, D.C. that July. The comparatively large number of unexplained reports in 1952 prompted further discussion. Most other years typically had about a dozen unexplained sightings. According to a CIA committee, the Robertson Panel, which met in 1953 and whose report was declassified in 1975, the ultimate goal of government investigations of UFOs was to debunk all sightings in a way that would decrease public interest in UFOs. Some individuals involved in the project, including American astronomer J. Allen Hynek, who served as lead scientist on the project for its entire span, later alleged that they were discouraged from pursuing extraterrestrial explanations for reported sightings. Hynek, in particular, was privately critical of Project Blue Book's lack of rigor and emphasis on debunking. Project Blue Book was terminated on December 17, 1969, after a 2-year report commissioned from the University of Colorado concluded, after reviewing the project's records and findings, that no UFO sightings had ever represented a threat to national security, shown definitive evidence of technology unknown to humankind, or been proved to be of extraterrestrial origin. The report indicated that there would be no great advantages for the Air Force to continue to study UFO sightings. So the precedent set by Project Blue Book and the way that they organized all of the sightings and debunked them is directly handled in the movie. There is a very interesting and pivotal scene during which you see government employees handling a large number of claims from the civilian populace and offering different explanations for what the phenomenon that the populace could have seen really might have been. Additionally, consultants were hired for the film who had worked on Project Blue Book during the 50s and 60s, so there's actual professional precedent here. It's also really interesting to note that the government, the United States government, including NASA, refused to participate. A fact that Spielberg took to mean that there was maybe more truth to what he was putting on screen than he had initially believed. The fourth and final angle from which I'd like to approach this is more of my own personal original reading. On my latest rewatch, I found that Close Encounters resonated with me as a story about language and how communication can transcend it. The extraterrestrials in Close Encounters of the Third Kind convey meaning through mathematics and telepathy. But in the end, the only means of proper conversation and real-time exchange of ideas is through art, through color, through light, and most importantly, through music. The breakdown of communication seems likewise important to the fabric of Close Encounters. Roy finds himself unable to communicate with Ronnie, his wife, despite the fact that they both speak the same language. Meanwhile, Lacombe must overcome the language barriers of the people of Earth in order to assemble a means of communication with the world beyond. The climactic encounter between humanity and the extraterrestrials is one of the most profound pieces of modern cinema. And it is one of the most impressive collaborations between Spielberg and Williams, the legendary John Williams who has scored nearly every one of Steven Spielberg's films. This Oscar-nominated score is a rare example of Williams's work being directly and overtly folded into the plot of the film. Williams's five-note motif is a brilliant piece of composition, intended to be somewhere between a fragment and a song, which Williams personally defined as being 3 and 7 notes, respectively. The five-note motif is so remarkable that it has become a shorthand for communication between humanity and life beyond this earth, appearing most recently in Project Hail Mary, another film about the bridging of communications across deep divides. So with all that being said, what was it about? The spiritual aspect of Close Encounters cannot be overstated. In a lot of ways, I think that the narrative follows a lot of biblical beats. There's a biblical allegory there between the pursuit of knowledge and the holding on to of faith in the face of complete and utter unknown and uncertainty. And yet, I think that the film almost attempts to subvert that at the very, very end by providing a direct answer to the question, is there life beyond this earth? And what is happening to Roy? It all becomes clear in the film's final moments. And if the movie really was about faith, I don't think that would necessarily be true, because, it's paramount to the idea of religious faith that there is no proof. Proof does not exist. You must hold on to your faith in the face of uncertainty, right? And so the pursuit of the knowledge and the discovery of the knowledge and the fact that in the end the truth is laid bare before the characters, I think directly comes into conflict with this. So there are elements of faith in the story, and yet the story seems to be shedding a lot of those ideas along the way. Then you have the genre reading, which really places this film, or sandwiches it really, between two very different types of science fiction. There are very few films that I think fall into this category of science fiction, a dedicated realism, yet a fantastical whimsy. I really do think that Project Hail Mary, in a lot of ways, felt to me to be the same kind of cloth as Close Encounters. And yet that film is much more character-driven, whereas Close Encounters is almost entirely plot. Like, the characters' personalities and their wants and needs get completely thrown out the window in the pursuit of the knowledge. And Roy is really gutted as a character. Like, everything that it was Roy is pulled out, and in place is put the need to get to the Devil's Tower, and the need to find out more about life beyond Earth. Historically, I think that this film is so fascinating because, again, it does really embody a lot of the things that Steven Spielberg seems to find interesting as an artist and as an individual. I'm very interested to see what he does with Disclosure Day, given the fact that I think the world we're living in today is a very, very different world from the one that you see depicted in Close Encounters, and yet the subject matter is kind of the same. So how is that adjusted for today's world? What does it look like when you take a lot of those same ideas and examine them under the microscope of 2026? Because the movie doesn't seem that concerned with the limitations of humanity's technology. In fact, it seems to depict humanity as being completely and totally ready for contact. I don't think that the historical setting really has all that much to do with what the movie's about, but it is a very interesting angle at which to look at it as an artifact of the 1970s. But if you asked me, what is Close Encounters of the Third Kind about? I would say language, and the ways in which we communicate even when words fail. Thank you so much for being here. Feel free to leave a review for the show wherever you're listening. And if you think you know somebody who might like the pod, share it around. You can watch video versions of the podcast as well as find clips from the film I've talked about today on my social media and YouTube pages. Just visit www.whatwastthataboutpodcast.com. From there, you can follow me wherever you like. Instagram, Letterboxd, you name it. Thanks for listening. I'll see you soon.